Hey, it's Jordan. I'm delighted to be joined by Ron Kamenkow. You are a long-time worker, and frankly, I think this is one of the biggest stories in America that naturally the mainstream media is ignoring. We're not there yet, but potentially there could be a massive railroad worker strike. President Biden appointed a special board recently because of a contract impasse, where basically, as I understand it, over 100,000 railroad workers have been working without a contract for many years. There's a lot of grievances, not just pay, but they basically don't have, days off. They are on call essentially 24/7, not to mention the conditions. So first, tell my audience a little bit about yourself, your career path, and what you've experienced, as a railroad worker in America, because from what I'm reading, these are some of the most, burdensome working conditions, scheduling, that I've heard of.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Jordan. I did hire out about 25, 26 years ago in Chicago with a railroad that mostly does not exist anymore called Conrail. At the time, it was a Class 1 railroad. In 1999, it was gobbled up by the other two big Class 1 railroads in the East, part of it going to Norfolk Southern and part of it going to CSX. Uh, Ironically, at that time, 1999, we had what was called a full scale full scale meltdown of the railroad and parked trains, very long dwell time in yards, very low speed over the road, and many of the problems that we're seeing here 23 years later, I first experienced firsthand when those corporations were incapable of properly merging the railroad into their network. And so we've seen this this story before. Union Pacific had a meltdown a few years earlier when they gobbled up the Southern Pacific and the Chicago Northwestern. And there's been multiple recorded cases where the rail industry just simply cannot properly manage the railroads and chronic short staffing. And in recent years, the railroad has moved to this model of cut just about everything to the bone and trying to not have one more person on the payroll than absolutely necessary. But this doesn't work well because railroads are prone to a boom and bust economy, of course. They're prone to floods and washout, and that's the situation basically that we're in now. And their only response is typical railroad, what I experienced when I first hired in nearly 3 decades ago, more discipline. The punishment will continue. So rather than take a progressive approach and make the workplace environment more desirable and enticing for people to hire in and to come to work, they simply crack the whip and say, we have a new availability policy and you will be here to come to work. And it's not working.
And I should have said at the beginning, President Biden basically stepped in to prevent a strike. He appointed this board based on the Railway Labor Act of 1926. So he appointed a presidential emergency board to basically mediate between the railroad companies and the rail unions. And basically, what this board has come up with, from my interpretation, are wage increases that do not really even match the rate of inflation, and very few changes as far as scheduling, more time off, things like that. Can you kind of give a little bit more on the problem that has been scheduling, where workers don't really get days off? They're on call quite a bit. Obviously, this affects family time and kind of having a work-life balance in the rail industry.
Yeah, the Presidential Emergency Board, it was PEB number 250. So there was 249 PEBs over the last century or so prior to this one. So it's nothing new for the President of the United States to step in and, under the Railway Labor Act, this is protocol, to appoint a three-person panel known as a Presidential Emergency Board to make recommendations. They're non-binding, but they do carry a lot of political weight. What was curious is that the union leadership was expecting a better PEB than this one, we would speculate. The rail carriers, on the other hand, from their point of view, they may have been expecting one that was quote unquote worse for them. As it turned out, the very next day, August 17th, we awoke to a jubilant rail industry. Its mouthpieces, the American Association of Railroads, and its bargaining wing, the National Carriers Conference Committee, were both crowing about that this was fair and equitable, and they were ready to move forward under the basis of these recommendations. Um, the unions, on the other hand, and the rank and file in particular, uh, not so happy. If you read the summary, um, and Railroad Workers United just came out with a bulletin yesterday morning that summarizes quite nicely the PEB's position on most work rule questions. So, leaving aside wages and healthcare for the moment, on the question of work rules, pretty much everything that the 12 different crafts and the 12 different unions asked for, the PEB basically had two responses. One was go back and continue to bargain, which is kind of ironic since the PEB is in place because bargaining has gone nowhere for 2.5 years. I'm not sure what makes the PEB believe that going back to the bargaining table is necessarily going to achieve a whole lot at this point. But yeah, their response is either go back to the bargaining table and bargain this with the carriers, or simply withdraw the proposal. And that was the response to about a dozen or more requests from the myriad unions for changes in work rules. And this, of course, encompasses the all important hours of work, time off the job, and so forth. So, for example, the unions asked for the ability to bargain over attendance policies. That was rejected by the PEB. The union asked for um, 3 additional federal holidays. That was rejected by the PEB. The union asked for the ability to have schedules that gave people a better idea of when they were going to work and having some semblance of regular off days for conductors and engineers. That once again was rejected by the PEB. And so, unfortunately, on issues of quality of work life, retention, and recruitment of railroad workers, particularly conductors and engineers in what's called the T&E craft, the PEB really did fail us because it's not addressing the reasons why people are leaving the industry basically in numbers heretofore completely unheard of. So it's a bit of a letdown at this point for a lot of us in the industry.
And could you kind of explain, what the attendance policy is? Because it's pretty brutal. The attendancy policy that most of these rail carriers mandate to their workers, very few days off, um, very few weekend days off from what I could tell. Workers I've read, working, weeks in a row without a day off. Can you kinda describe, the attendance policies?
Yeah, so railroading is a 24/7 industry, and we have lots of industries that are 24/7. Of course, healthcare, most of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Nevertheless, that's no excuse for the workers to have to be 24/7. Um, But historically, railroad workers have worked very, very long shifts. We are now regulated by federal law to a limit of 12 hours, at least those of us in safety sensitive occupations like engineer, conductor, yard master, and so forth. But you can return to work generally in 10 hours. Um, we are on call for the most part. If you are a freight conductor or a freight engineer working for a class one railroad in this country, basically you're on call. And the historically, we had the right to do what's called mark off. And so if you wanted time off, if you were feeling fatigued, if you had a personal matter in your life you wanted to attend to, or if you just wanted to just take off and just drop out for a few days or even a few weeks, you never got paid because we don't have sick time. We've never had sick time in the train and engine craft and in other crafts as well on the railroad. And so while that was a negative, it was probably a net positive gain for us because very few jobs do you have the right to just simply take time off when you want. You don't get paid, but hey, I get to take off. Well, that all went away. And now things are very, very harsh. They've swung in the complete and opposite direction where there's a point system now on many of the big class one railroads, and it seems to be that that's going to be the wave of the future. So it's quote unquote objective in nature, but that's ridiculous because life isn't objective. Different people get sick, get pregnant, have family issues, have bigger or larger families, have sick children, and for all kinds of reasons need time off work. And it's kind of a no excuse policy. And this makes life very, very difficult. So you see people with 10, 15, and 20 years seniority who never in the past would have quit a railroad job. They're jacking it in and just literally quitting on the spot and saying they've had enough, they can't take it. In addition, people have been fired under these new attendance policies as well for poor performance. The thing we got to understand here, Jordan, and the industry will never fess up to this and bring this out. The industry likes to say, look, we give these guys 4 or 5 weeks vacation. True, if you have 15, 20, or 25 years, that's first thing on the vacation. Oh, we give these guys 12 personal days. Once again, true, but you build up to that over 10, 20, 30 years of seniority to get those personal days. Then they'll say that they have holidays. Well, true, some crafts, particularly in the yard, will get paid, but that doesn't mean you get the day off. So when we're talking about time off, holidays don't necessarily apply to many workers on the railroad. You might make double time and a half for working the holiday, let's say, but this isn't what we're talking about here. We're talking about quality of work life, the ability to take time off, be with our families, and have a life. So once again, they're being disingenuous when they talk about holidays, personal days, and vacation. But the big one is we don't have scheduled off days in the train and engine craft on class one railroads in this country in freight service. For the most part, every engineer and conductor who's out there running a train right now down the railroad in all 48 states doesn't have weekends off, doesn't even have Monday, Tuesday off. We do not have scheduled days off. So the average worker starts with, let's say, 104 days off per year right out of the box, right? 2 out of 7. We start with 0 out of 7. And so under those conditions, to mandate these harsh availability policies, and keep in mind, we don't have sick time either. So we're not getting paid when we do take off work, when we call up the caller, the crew caller, and say, mark me off sick. I do not get paid for that time. So uh, it's a bit ironic that we're, faced with such harsh demands for our attendance at work, given the existing conditions already.
Right. And I just want to point out, because obviously This is America, which I call the United Corporations of America. These railroad industries that are, basically giving you, you know, no time off really. And that's why so many people are leaving. They're doing pretty damn good for themselves financially. This is the rail industry, which carries about 40% of US freight, is dominated by just seven major railways that collected a record 1.18 billion in fees for freight stuck in supply chain bottlenecks in the first 9 months of 2021, and has seen a flurry of lawsuits over these charges. So one point over $1 billion basically, just in the first 9 months of last year. I don't know what it is this year. Uh, you also they estimated that since 2010, the industry spent 46 billion on or more on stock buybacks and dividends than on maintenance and equipment investments. So they're making money and their shareholders are making money, but they're not giving their workers, reasonable time off. The wage increases that they're proposing don't even match inflation. And like you said, people who have been working there for 15, 20 years are, heading for the exits.
Yeah, interestingly, in speaking to the Presidential Emergency Board, and all of this is in the 124-page PEB report, the rail carriers actually touched on this, and they had the audacity to say that their railroad employees had nothing to do with them taking the risk and then making this kind of money. I find it kind of curious, that there's a risk. The railroads, the class one railroads, made record profits right through the Great Recession of 2008. The class one railroads made record profits right through the pandemic. And so for 25 years now, the rail industry has been cranking up record profits, record low operating ratios, uh, astronomical pay for CEOs, and so forth. And so, in this context, one would hope that their employees were well compensated, and one would also hope that the rail industry would be expanding. Rail is the most efficient way to move freight and passengers. It has a very low carbon footprint. Um, a ton of freight can move 3 times farther on a rail for a gallon of fuel than, let's say, a semi moving down the highway. Railroads are just undoubtedly the safest and most environmentally friendly means of transportation. However, we're moving less freight than we did 16 years ago. Now, this is almost hard to grasp. Here's an industry that is making record profits, that has record high stock prices, yet during this same 16 years, the trucking industry has expanded by about 40%. The economy has grown by leaps and bounds. And yet, here's this great, vital, national resource called the US Rail Network, which, by the way, is still the biggest rail network in the world, bar none. And yet, we're not really making use of it to its fullest potential. The rail industry, instead of growing its business, has decided that it can actually shrink its business, cut costs, raise prices, and achieve its financial goals in that manner. But this isn't really a help to shippers. It's certainly not a help to Amtrak, as delayed trains are a chronic feature of Amtrak because we're stuck behind 3 mile long freight trains, which is all part of this modus operandi of cutting costs and saving money. Um, and it's not good for the nation. It's certainly not good for the environment, because if we're not moving more freight by rail, it means we're moving more freight by truck. And this isn't good for motorists. It's not good for our highway system. It's not good for the environment and clean air and so forth and so on. So tragically, much of the rail industry's profits, as you pointed out, Jordan, is going into stock buybacks and dividends. exorbitant salaries for CEOs. And this is nothing unusual. This is sort of the economy. This is the way capitalism is working, or not working for that matter. And so they do invest a certain amount in capital expenditure, but it's a little disingenuous when they talk about the tens of billions that they have spent on capital expenditure, because really the vast majority of what they're spending isn't capital expenditure in the true sense of the word. It's basic maintenance. It's on rail and ties and ballast and the things that you basically have to do. If you owned a house, these things are not considered improvements. In other words, expansions. Putting a new roof on and getting the house painted uh, are simply basic maintenance of the physical plant that needs to be done. In terms of double tracking, electrification, higher speed limits, more classification yards, and other infrastructure, there's practically nothing has been spent in the last 25 years.
Mm. And, with the supply chain crisis that we've been in, which obviously the pandemic played a big role, obviously, if you have unprecedented level of rail and freight workers quitting, that's going to have a domino effect in terms of delaying the rail transportation, which also plays a part in inflation because we already have a supply shortage. If there's delays in moving products because workers just can't work the job anymore. They're not getting enough time off. Their pay is not good enough. Workers are quitting in bulk. Then we have further supply bottlenecks, which then are passed down to the customer, basically. Can you kind of talk about the effect of the exodus of rail workers on the supply chain crisis?
Yeah, and there's lots of different theories, of course, as to how the supply chains got so buggered up. Um, and granted, there was a steep drop in international and domestic freight traffic for the first few months, of course, of the pandemic. And then once the pandemic got sorted out, things rebounded, and there was a huge spike in international traffic. China cranked up once again. Hundreds of ships were coming across the Pacific. And then there was obviously going to be bottlenecks. I mean, these sorts of booms and busts, mass fluctuations are going to wreak havoc upon the supply chain. But if an industry is not prepared for such fluctuation, as the rail industry has not been, in general, we have been operating under a model called precision scheduled railroading. It's a bit of a misnomer, but basically what it's all about is cutting costs and moving the same amount of freight with far less workers. In fact, we lost 25 to 30% of our workforce leading up to and including into the pandemic. So the rail industry was extremely ill prepared for the rebound in traffic when it came. And so in addition to just naturally having these, supply chain bottlenecks at places like LA Long Beach and other ports around the world, various pinch points, um, now you just didn't have enough conductors and engineers to move a train out of the port. And then numerous crews would outlaw under the hours of service law, and there would not be a rested crew to move the train. So now a train en route from LA Long Beach to Chicago would be tied down, and that means putting handbrakes on it while the crew is taken off the train, taken to a hotel to get its federal mandatory rest. The train sits there until a relief crew is rested and can come and recrew the train. And so, under normal circumstances, let's say maybe 5% of your train crews would outlaw and need to be recrewed. There are places in the country now where that figure is up to 10, 15, and even 20%. So that 1 out of 5 trains that make a start will end up being sidelined, at least momentarily, if not for hours and hours, and in some cases, days, in wait for a rested crew. And so the railroad is trying to dig itself out of a hole right now. Um, but ironically, that brings us around full circle to the whole question of bargaining and the potential for a national strike. One would think that an industry that has been severely crippled by its lack of employees, by people leaving the industry in unprecedented numbers, that industry might come to the bargaining table with its unions and say, hey, look, what can we do to make this workplace more attractive? What can we do to retain people? What can we do to recruit people and make this a job that was once known as a very, very good blue collar job, one of the best jobs you could get, especially without a college education? What can we do? But the industry isn't saying that. The industry is coming to us saying, we do not want to change anything, basically. Um, so you wonder what the future of the railroad industry is going to look like. Are we going to be in a perpetual crisis uh, and be short-staffed? I certainly hope not. I used to encourage and entice uh, friends, neighbors, strangers, just about everybody. I said, get a job on the railroad. You know, why are you working in this coffee shop? Or why are you doing a job where you can make a lot more money and actually enjoy yourself? It's actually a wonderful job in so many ways. I cannot, in good conscience now, suggest to people that they get a job in train and engine service or probably any of the crafts on the railroad. It's extremely unfortunate.
Right. And where do things go from here? I mean, obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, over 100,000 workers. So if the railroads don't move with, at least on the scheduling, a better offer, um, I don't know what you think about the offer they made on pay. From what I could tell, it's better, but it doesn't really meet inflation. Could we see a major strike, and what would that look like? Because, I mean, I know my history. I don't remember the last time 100,000 workers went on strike in America.
Yeah, and the last time that railroad workers went on strike um, was 1991, so over 30 years ago. It's very difficult for railroad workers to actually strike, and in fact, this is probably a huge problem, and in some ways might be the root of why we're in the mess that we're in. If railroad workers were not so hamstrung by the Railway Labor Act, then there would be railroad strikes, and there used to be lots of railroad strikes. And I'm not saying that that's the best way to run an economy, but when an employer exceeds their authority, when an employer refuses to bargain in good faith, when an employer has worked itself into a hole the way the railroad industry has done here in recent years, if its workforce is capable of actually fomenting a successful strike, it reins that industry in to to do the right thing. Strikes do have a way of balancing things out, and workers and railroad workers are no exception. Don't ask for the moon and the stars. They simply ask for basic, reasonable, humane working conditions, and that's what's really on the table here. And under the Railway Labor Act, we've been bargaining now for 2.5 years. We've finally gone through the Presidential Emergency Board stage of the act. It has issued its recommendations. The rail unions are free to reject those recommendations and exercise their right to self-help on September 16th or later. However, if we were to exercise our right to self-help on September 16th, it's quite likely that Congress would meet within hours and pass legislation uh, remanding us back to work. And so the ability to actually exercise that power that we ostensibly have as workers through our unions, to rectify the situation and to restore some semblance of balance of power between employers on the one hand and workers on the other, um, is very difficult for us to achieve as a result of the Railway Labor Act. Now, will there be a strike? I don't know. Will that strike be quashed by the federal government in a matter of hours? Once again, I don't know. It's hard to say given the complexion of Congress. Uh, Political wrangling and maneuvering between the two parties could potentially delay a back to work order for a day or two or three. But one thing we do know is if there is a strike, regardless of whether it's a matter of hours, a matter of days, or a matter of weeks, which, like I say, is extremely unlikely, much of the economy will be affected. And the rail industry stands to lose, of course, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, simply by shutting down the entire network, getting everyone in train and engine service back home, and then 10 hours later or 2 days later, or what it might be, gearing back up, getting everybody back on the trains, and getting the system running again and getting it fluid. It's not fluid now, so to get it back into some semblance of normalcy could take days or even weeks, or even months.
I'd love your thoughts, not to get so political, but, Biden, he has run and he has kinda marketed himself as a union guy. He likes to talk about his father and, the dignity of a job and that he's very pro-union. But what you're describing obviously goes beyond Biden, is a lot of politicians that claim to be, union guys and gals, uh, that essentially they would essentially knock down the union's right to strike, obviously because of this law from the early 20th century. So there seems to be a mismatch between the rhetoric of Biden and other politicians that they're with the workers, they're with the unions. But if you actually what you don't really have much ability to go on a strike based on the Railroad Act.
Yeah, it's true, and this is one thing that generally Republicans and Democrats agree on completely. And we may see this spectacle, and I'm sure the media will remark about it. That if and when railroad workers strike, the vote will be incredibly lopsided, probably somewhere on the order of 450 to three, to send us back to work, and generally send us back to work under the terms, the recommendation of the PEB. And so, there's an argument to be made that in effect the U.S. is violating international, labor codes by doing this because they're usurping the right of workers to take self-help activity, to strike. And it is one of the basic codes agreed to, internationally, that workers do have the right to strike. And ostensibly, we do have that right in this country as railroad workers. But then, of course, what the Railway Labor Act gives with one hand, it takes away with the other. So, there's people who call for the Railway Labor Act to be amended. Um, it would be a fine idea. There are certain amendments to both NLRA and RLA that we certainly could stand to see in this country. But putting it on the table could risk actually having it amended in the wrong way and making it even more restrictive. So it is what it is. We live to labor under it. Um, it's in the coming days. I think we will see. Um, well, the story will be told as to how this is going to shake out. Um, but right now, workers are still digesting what all has been recommended by the labor or the PEB. The unions are still deciding, what position to take. And whether or not we'll actually see a tentative agreement put before the membership for a vote in the coming weeks remains to be seen.
Mhm. And when's the deadline for a contract? If there's gonna be a contract, when's the deadline? And if there's not, how soon could we potentially see, even though you say it's unlikely, a strike?
Yeah, September 16th is the date, and that's 30 days from the announcement of the PEB, which of course was announced August 16th. But that doesn't mean that there will be a strike on the 16th, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be an agreement on the 16th. If the rail industry and the unions are back at the bargaining table, attempting to hammer out a tentative agreement based upon the PEB recommendations, the parties can mutually agree to extend that deadline. So bargaining could proceed apace for quite some time into the fall, or even longer, possibly. And then, of course, we need time to actually have a ratification vote, and the parties would agree to extend the deadline, most likely until the vote tallies come in and so forth. And then at that point, if the rank and file were to reject the tentative agreement, once again, we're in a situation where we could actually strike at that point, or once again go back to the bargaining table. So it's a long, drawn out, convoluted process.
And I should also say, it's not one, you're talking about 13 different unions, correct? You're talking about 13 different separate rail unions. So there's a lot of different, factions here that have to agree on something.
Exactly. And this is a historic moment for us because it is the first time that all of the unions that are party to the National Freight Agreement, and there's 12 of them, are actually bargaining as a group. They're completely united as the United Rail Unions, and this includes all the different crafts that are represented by unions in the United States that work for these large Class 1 rail corporations. And so there's obviously a lot of internal politics and lots of historic differences between the different unions and the different crafts. So hopefully that coalition will hold together throughout this process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time, Ron Cannoncow. You are a longtime rail worker, and we'll definitely stay on this because could be historic. We'll see.
Thanks, Jordan. We'll keep in touch. I'm sure the coming days will tell the story.
Absolutely, for sure. Thanks again. Take care.